Good evening and welcome to Merit TV Canada's Election Watch. We are post-election now, being Friday. As we move into the weekend, there's been a lot that has unfolded this past week since the Liberals and Prime Minister Mark Carney was able to etch out a minority government. And we've been recapping all week about what's happened with the Liberals' minority government, the Conservatives increasing their seat count, but also their leader, Pierre Poilievre, losing his seat. We've also seen the fall of the NDP, and that's a way you can properly describe it, the fall of the NDP and Jagmeet Singh, who not only lost his seat, but he also stepped down as party leader. And also you can say that the party was decimated from its mid-20s, the amount of seats that it held, to less than 12, which makes it lose its official party status, meaning is actually 7 seats that they retained. Those 7 are now independents in the House of Commons, which carves a potential pathway for Mark Carney and the Liberals to see if any of those, all they would need is 3 of them to cross the aisle and join the Liberals to actually form a functioning majority in the government. So all of this to say and to be watching as we go forward, which would really obviously help the Liberals govern the way that they want to govern. A couple areas I do want to focus on today is Alberta independence and the rise and the sentiment that is happening in Alberta, potentially Saskatchewan as well. I also want to look at, have we moved back to a 2-party system here in Canada? Because we have several parties available with the Green Party, the PPC, the NDP of the Bloc, which represents Quebec, as well as the Conservatives and the Liberals. So there's 6 main parties that are there. But this year, this election, we have seen the fall of the NDP, which has happened before in the past history. We have seen the Green Party only get 1 seat, which was Elizabeth May. We've also watched the PPC, who, although they got 140,000 and change in votes, which is substantially down from the last election, didn't get any seats in the House of Commons. The NDP holds 7, formerly the NDP, but Conservatives and the Liberals are the 2 main parties who own respectively 169 seats, and the Conservatives are somewhere in the 150 range. The question is, have we moved to a 2-party system? And if we have moved to a 2-party system or back to a 2-party system, does that mean that Eastern Canada will always represent Western Canada? Meaning, does Western Canada simply have the votes to be able to outvote what Eastern Canada wants? This is what is fueling the idea behind Alberta separatism, about Alberta independence, about Albertans charting their own course, because they have seemed to over and over again feel that Eastern Canada, the results of the election are decided in Quebec and Ontario before we even start to move west. And this is what seems to be rising, this idea that people are not in control of their own future. The idea of Alberta charting its own course, being energy rich, resource rich, have a lot of ingenuity and a lot of this idea to progress forward as a society, seems to fall short in most people's eyes when they aren't in control of their future or feel that they're not in control of their own future. And it's a question I think we have to analyze, because in a Canada, a confederation as diverse as we are, have we moved to a place where our confederation is operating in form, but we're not actually operating in function? There's a similar movement that happened with Preston Manning in the 2000s, as the Reform Party was coming to basically tell Ottawa the West wants in. And the question we got to ask ourselves is there room at the table to actually be able to make the West and the East both happy together? A place where both sections of the country and the different provinces that make up the East and the West feel that they can thrive and they can move forward. And Mark Carney, Prime Minister Mark Carney, is going to have a big job if he wants to try to unite Canadians. Or we may find out he has no interest, because if he has a majority, then he can govern the way that he wants to govern. And if you want to know how he's going to govern, you can read his book Values, which indicates in the first 3 chapters and the last 3 chapters how he thinks about the idea of achieving net zero, about this type of governance. You also look at Mark Carney's involvement with the Liberal government over the last 10 years and the amount of consulting that he has done and policies that he helped bring forth, is that it gives you an idea of, is that something that is going to help the West want to stay at the table? Or is he going to reach out an olive branch? Today, it was surprising to me that he did make a mention that he's not going to delay or play any games with Pierre Poilievre, because Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives have announced that he will be taking a seat here in Alberta, and there is an MP that is going to be stepping down. And Mark Carney said he's not going to try to delay that, although he could possibly delay 8 months. He has made a statement saying he's not going to play games and delay it, which, you know what, I think is a nice gesture. It's a good gesture to show I'm willing to work, but we'll see how that actually plans out. Premier Smith has got a lot of things in front of her to be able to assess as Albertans and Alberta citizens want to express how they're going to want to move forward with a referendum, which will happen in the next several months. There are independent groups who have gathered plenty of signatures that have already made up a majority, if not all those signatures that are required to actually trigger this idea of a referendum. But as Bruce Party has stated in an interview that we have done on our show Citizen, as well through our election coverage night on Monday, that this process of Alberta moving towards this direction may be the necessary medicine that Canada needs to actually get back on track economically, but also getting the provinces working back together. Anyways, I'm going to be joined in just a moment by former Premier of New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs, who's got some great insights. I'm going to ask him a couple questions about what would you do if you are in Danielle Smith's shoes, and what is your idea when it comes to moving forward as a whole nation of Canada. But stick with us. We'll be back right after this break. Welcome back to Merit TV Canada's Election Watch. My name is David Craig. Thank you for sticking with us. I am joined right now by former Premier of New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs. Mr. Higgs, it is a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. Thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome, David. Thanks for the opportunity.
You have a very unique perspective in the position that you held in New Brunswick as the Premier for multiple terms, and I'm going to pick your brain on a couple of the things that are happening across our country, being post-election, what's happening in Alberta. But before we get into those, I'd love to hear just generally, what are your thoughts? Now we've had 3-4 days after the election on Monday with the Liberals walking away with a minority government, and I think the biggest story, it's a couple big stories with the NDP maybe kind of falling off a cliff in terms of their polling and their results, but Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservatives, leader of the opposition, losing his seat. And I'd love to hear just 10,000 feet, what was your reaction as you were watching, and also what have you digested in the last couple of days?
Well, obviously disappointment because I was certainly supporting the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre. I feel in any other circumstances it would have been a Conservative majority government. I mean, we saw that several months ago in polls, but the Trump effect put all of the nation kind of on alert to thinking all of a sudden there needed to be someone new come in to deal with President Trump. I feel that this is a lot of smoke screen that Trump keeps blowing, and at the end of the day, there will be serious negotiations, and we'll get that resolved. But to dismiss 10 years of a very poor record, a record that any government should be out of office on, and all of a sudden the Liberals to have created such a record, but then at the same token, they're the ones that are going to fix it. I'm hopeful that Prime Minister Carney will make the difference that he talks about. So we need to remain optimistic for our country, but obviously I think the Trump effect made the difference in that election.
And do you think ultimately President Trump and his comments and his trolling of Canada also was a big part of NDP voters moving away from NDP into the Liberal side? And any connection there? Because that's a big part of why, and you made just a quick comment, you made a great point there. Any other time, the Conservatives would for sure have a minority, possibly a majority, because you look back at several elections in the past with Trudeau, even with Chrétien, going back to Harper, the same numbers, very similar numbers, they were majority government. So he had that much of an impact, in your opinion?
Oh, absolutely, and it's all at and they're not the only ones that talked about that. Certainly, Premier Ford only talked about the actual, President Trump and the issue and the impact it'll have on Ontario, which it will and does if it materializes to its extent. I think that in relation to what it means to Canada and what we see from where we're going in the long run, I just believe at the end of the day, we've seen a big shift to the left, and people came out in droves, basically, to support the philosophy and the ideology of the Liberal government, which I can't imagine will change all of a sudden.
Hmm.
Prime Minister Carney was there for a good portion of that mandate and advising the Prime Minister Trudeau.
Okay.
So when you think about that, there was a consolidated effort to defeat the Conservatives. And nowhere was that more prevalent than in Pierre Poilievre's own riding.
Hmm.
Imagine 90 plus candidates. Now, where would that ever come from? And what kind of organization would it take to have 90 independent candidates? And why wouldn't there be an investigation of democracy and say, how
Yeah.
does this happen? What kind of concerted effort? And how many of the people involved in arranging or organizing that were on a government payroll of some sort? Maybe one group after another that receives government funding, and all of a sudden there's their focus, defeat the leader. I'm
Hmm.
really pleased to hear that Pierre Poilievre is going to be able to run in a by-election in Alberta. I commend the individual that stepped down because I think we need his voice, and he's proven to be a very effective voice in Parliament.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up because MP Damien Currick has announced that he will be stepping down from his seat at Battle River Crowfoot, which is here in Alberta. He'll be stepping aside, and there will be a by-election held. And I'll give Mark Carney credit in his comments. He said today he's not going to be playing any games and will support a by-election as fast as possible to happen in that area.
Yep.
But something you just mentioned regarding the 91 candidates in Pierre Poilievre's riding of Carleton, Canada. Now this is not obviously illegal because they went through the Elections Canada process, and I think that has to be thoroughly looked at because obviously it's a very low threshold if you can get that many. I know where I personally voted, I had 5 names on my ballot, and I'm sure that was probably consistent across the country.
Yeah.
So when you talk about an investigation into that, is that something that Elections Canada needs to look at for reform and to actually secure this so it operates better, or do you think there was other interference going on?
Absolutely, they should. Elections Canada should be the primary source of understanding that. Where have we ever seen a slate of candidates to that
Yeah.
extent? And that just doesn't happen by all of a sudden a great interest in one particular riding by a whole bunch of individuals. It happens through a consolidated effort to try to confuse and defeat the candidate.
Mm.
And I think that the fact that media didn't do anything, say anything, it wasn't even a major talking point in any of the discussions throughout the campaign,
Yeah.
particularly the CBC, which maybe one wouldn't be surprised. But it's disappointing because you can't dismiss an assault on democracy like we saw in his own writing. And I just feel that there's only one way to is not to dismiss it, not to sweep it under the rug, but actually investigate and how did these names all come about? And I'll bet if you interviewed them, they were names only. Probably half
Yeah.
the candidates hardly knew they were even on a ballot until they went to vote.
I think that's a fair point. You get 10 candidates, 12 candidates in the riding, sure, but when you get up to 91 individual candidates, I'm not even sure what the second most candidates were in any particular riding, but I would not think it's anywhere close to 91.
Oh
That's
no.
a fair point, and I hope it's going to be looked at. I do want to shift over to Alberta, and I want to get your perspective. Being a former premier of New Brunswick, you understand what it takes to lead a province. You understand that the citizens that you represent in a province, they vary in terms of their political outlook, their lifestyle, in terms of what they're trying to do. But you're trying to move the province forward within the Canadian Confederation, and I want to move our attention to Alberta and Premier Danielle Smith because she's in an interesting spot right now. I know Alberta independence has it's not brand new. It's been around for decades, but it seems like in the last number of years, especially I would say since COVID, also the fact of Alberta energy seeming to be more and more landlocked, not getting support for even interprovincial trade, or even being able to get outside of our country at proper prices. There just seems to be a growing sentiment that Albertans are forgotten by Ottawa and if you talk to different maybe separatists, maybe independents, guys who want to chart their own future, there's a lot of frustration building up here. From your perspective,
Yep.
what should Danielle Smith be doing? Any advice for her, and just general thoughts on what's been happening here?
Well, I think she has a valid argument, and I said that during my time in office. I was very outspoken in that regard because I mean, I was a big advocate for the Energy East. I came from an environment in the energy sector and worked for Irving Oil and for years for
Yeah.
my whole career. Um, And the point that I was making is certainly we were bringing in foreign crude, and using our own crude was only made good sense. I've always, felt that as a province that, wasn't able to, let's say, fund its own way, we are part of a recipient of transfer payments. And I was thankful to get them, but I wasn't proud to get them. I
Hmm.
wanted to see our resources developed, and we have natural gas that has we couldn't get started, we couldn't get the support, and the federal government certainly wasn't interested.
Yeah.
And I said, it just is not fair for a province to take money from resources while at the same time having those same resources in your own province. And I'm not alone
Hmm.
in that regard. I mean, Quebec, many provinces would be the similar situation, but prepared to take the money from those resources as equalization. And I don't think that's part of national interest. And then having said that, it's also in relation to national interest that Quebec shouldn't be the blockade that prevents the connection from east to west. And I know in Energy East that was the issue combined with Bill 69, but there
Hmm.
wasn't the social line license as such, as Premier Legault often stated. But there needs to be a national interest in every province. I've never seen it in Quebec
Hmm.
until this election, maybe, but only a national interest to protect, I would say, the interests of Quebec. So Daniel Smith, Premier Smith, in my view, is absolutely right to finally challenge the policies that have put the province behind the eight ball, and basically say, I want the same privileges as Quebec, which I've heard her say often, and she's absolutely right. Because unlike Quebec, the Alberta economy is been a major force for every one of us, especially in the smaller provinces. And I've never heard Premier Smith or members of the larger provinces ever be dismissive of the support for Canadian identity.
Hmm.
But you can't tie their hands in their economic growth by an ideology that does not fit really the science around the ability to expand natural gas and shut down coal plants worldwide. I mean, there's an economic and there's an emissions benefit there that is easily scientifically validated, and yet the federal government refused to deal with it. And I
Hmm.
met with them several times on that very point. So I would say she has a very valid case, and she needs policies that reflect the best interests of Alberta, but they also reflect the best interests, economic interests of other provinces, particularly the smaller ones.
What do you think of Premier Smith's move she did the other day about lowering the threshold for to enact a referendum in Canada about independence? I believe that the signatures required were dropped from top of my head, I think of 600,000 plus signatures to 175 or 185,000 signatures. Thoughts on that? Is that part of moving that direction to chart our own
Yeah.
course?
Yes, I think it is, and it's part of saying I'm serious. And
Okay.
and and I think that we have seen the federal government, the Liberal government, has not taken Alberta's concerns seriously,
Yeah.
and it's time they did. And so she has to move in the direction that she must in order to bring that validation to her and the wishes of the Albertans. But also, I've heard her say many times about her pride in the country and her national interest and focus. But you can't have a noose around her neck in trying to maintain that while at the same time continue to put policies in place that erode their economy. And that's
Well,
what we've seen. And so she has to do what's necessary. And when she makes a statement like "all we want is what Quebec has," she's spot on, because there's a reality in that. And I mean, Quebec is a major recipient of transfer payments.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see what unfolds over the next several months here in Alberta because there definitely is a rise in sentiment. I know a lot is seen on social media, but there's many independent groups who are garnering hundreds of thousands of signatures independently.
Hmm.
And that's not the official act, but they're essentially gathering the information they need so they can migrate that over once it's officially enacted. And I'll say, as an Alberta, a citizen here in Alberta and a proud Albertan, is I am happy to see Danielle Smith moving that direction. And I'll quote what Professor Bruce Party quoted maybe a couple of weeks ago when we had him on our program. He said that this very act of Alberta potentially pursuing its own independence or pursuing its independence may be the act that actually helps Canada get its act together
Oh,
with
I
charting its
think,
own future.
David, I agree. I agree totally. I think that for how many years has Quebec held us ransom as a country and as a nation?
Hmm,
And
fair
it's
point.
all done. And I would go on to say this whole idea of free trade across the country between all provinces and territories. I mean, it's great in concept, and I believe that that's certainly a direction to head in. And Prime Minister Carney said that they want to have the federal requirements, and I don't know how significant that part is. In any event,
Yeah.
it's usually the interprovincial ones that are creating, or at least I'm familiar with, that are creating the problem. But for us in New Brunswick, we could certainly do that with Nova Scotia and maybe even in Ontario,
Hmm.
or for other provinces. But the subsidization and the trade requirements in Quebec, the fluidity of movement of skilled labor, very different and very
Hmm.
protectionist. And
Yes.
and and if that continues, because it's always continued under the guise of a cultural importance and a distinct society. And if that continues, it disrupts the ability for us to be the nation of strength that we have been talking about, and that the new prime minister continues to talk about as is going to be his mandate.
That's a great point because we do have the raw makings of what it takes to be a great nation, a strong nation when you can work together that way. I appreciate
We
that.
just can't get out of our own way, it seems.
And you know what? I'm glad you said that because one of my own I know we talked about President Donald Trump at the beginning of the conversation, and and although that is something Canada has to deal with this tariff talk, trade talk, that's important. It's not anything new in the sense of us figuring out trade negotiations with them. I've been saying it this way: we're married to the United States. We're going through some speed bumps right now, like every marriage does, but we'll find our way through it. But my hope is that this is not a distraction. Like having unity around this idea, which in a sense you could call unity surrounded by victimization, that we're a victim of the US. I think that's a wrong way to go about it because I hope it's not a distraction from us actually looking inwardly at what problems and issues and policies have we been okay with as Canadians over the last number of years, call it a decade, that's actually maybe put us in a spot that we aren't economically, I should say we're economically weak and we haven't been in a great spot. So I appreciate your comments there.
We didn't get here in this state as a country because of Donald Trump.
That's right.
We got here because of poor political policies that have been subsidized over time because of our resources, our natural resources. But when you start to curb those to a point now, it's infecting the very economy and the ability for you to fund what's required and what people value for social services and protection. That's when you have to rethink. Okay, all of these policies that's taken advantage of the opportunity of whoever's in government or whoever promised whatever they promised to get in government. It's like now can't realize that that got us here, not the Trump issue got us here. It was the
Yeah.
policies that one government over another kept pandering to the public in order to get elected, because the thirst to be elected is so much greater than the thirst to do what's right.
Huh.
And
Wow.
that's what's been the struggle. I think we've seen in the conservative values many people elected that want to do what's right, and I'd like to think that same thing would apply to some of the liberals that got elected as well. But it's not doing the same old thing. It's looking seriously inward. And to your point, that's what's going to be required. So it can't be just talk. Trump may have been the excuse of why they won the election, but let it be the catalyst then
Yeah.
to make our economy and then the decisions necessary to do it right.
Well, that's a powerful point, and I'm going to have to end on that because it was a really great point, and we have to go to break pretty shortly here. But Mr. Higgs, Blaine Higgs, former Premier of New Brunswick, thank you so much for your time for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, David. Have a great day.
Yeah, stick with us. We'll be back right after this break. Welcome back to Merit TV Canada's Election Watch. My name is David Craig. We just finished with former Premier of New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs, who had some great insights about where do we go, how does Premier Smith handle this idea of Alberta independence, as there are many Albertans who are moving this direction. Also is able to have some great thoughts. I hope you can take a chance to listen and to take some advice from him. I do believe that Canada can move forward and we can figure out our future, but there has to be some key things that has to change in order for East and West to work together. That's my hope. That's my ideal, is that Canada can come back stronger where the West is able to prosper. The West is represented properly in Ottawa as well. The fact that the East and West can find ways to work together, even if there are differences of opinion and difference of thoughts, or even differences in how you govern, is that we have to look to what we have in common and where we can actually gain ground and work together as Canadians, as opposed to focusing on what's separates us. And I know there's many people who believe that that is done and they've given up on that. I am not there yet, but I'm willing to walk it out and be able to see what happens and accept what does happen. And I do think it's a good process for Albertans to go through, to walk through this to see, is this something that we want? Anyways, there's a lot on the table. We got to cut it short because we're running out of time, but I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Thank you for sticking with us during this election watch. Have a great weekend. My name's David Craig. This is Merit TV Canada's Election Watch.